Let's jump straight into it, and then we'll slow it down and go over things in a bit more detail later. So there's lots of shortcut key changes. Straight out of the gate, let's say we can come over to our splash screen over here and set our interaction to the old method, 2.79, if you really get lost. But otherwise, let's just keep it to Blender 2.8. To bring up our user preferences, we can hit F4, and then we get this menu where we can find user preferences at the bottom there. To deselect, we're going to want to use Alt-A. We can still use A to select everything, but if we hit A again now, it's not going to do anything. We're better off using Alt-A. So A to select everything and then Alt-A to deselect everything. If I hit A one more time, we can actually still double tap A to deselect. So there's multiple ways of doing that now. We can use the tilde key, which is on my QWERTY keyboard to the left of the 1 key underneath the escape key. So if we hit that, we can get our camera's pie menu. And remember, the beauty of these is to be able to gesture really. So you can just hit that tilde key and then switch to the left at the same time, and we'll get an automatic jump into those views. We can also go Shift and tilde, and now we'll get that first person shooter kind of controls with W, A, S, and D. That used to be on Shift F, but it's now moved to Shift tilde. Something else that is pretty interesting on that is that if you hold Alt first and then gesture with the middle mouse down, for example, we're going to switch to a top orthographic. In fact, depending on which way we're gesturing, is just going to allow us to flip our view around. We still have the numbers on the numpad that we can switch to though, like 1 to get into front orthographic. So they're still there, it's just extra options basically. We can go Control Space to go full screen instead of Shift Space now, because Shift Space, if we left click and drag down and then set this bottom one to a timeline, if we go Shift Space, you'll see it starts to play the animation, and then Shift Space to stop it again. If we tab into edit mode on this object and we deselect everything with Alt A, and we wanted to select a face, what we could do before was go Control Tab, but now that's going to switch our modes. So instead we can use the 1, 2, and 3 keys. So 1 for vertex, 2 for edges, and then 3 for faces. But we can still use the tab key to tab back in and out of edit mode and object mode in this instance. We've still got I that we can press to insert keyframes into things. I'm just going to undo that with Control Z. But you'll notice we now have these little diamonds that show up over these dots that we have, which show us which attributes can be animated. So we can just click on that one and it makes it fairly clear. And then we just click it again to remove it. Something very cool that we've got in Blender now is the multi-object editing, and this is something I'd used to find myself doing quite a lot back in Maya, back in the old days. Say you had a separate object for the window like this, which is just sat in another object acting as the main building, and we realized the windows need to be a bit higher. Well, you can just shift select both of them and tab into edit mode, one above the QWERTY keyboard to get our vertex select. And then if I open up our tool shelf with T and switch over to the select border, I can left click and drag across these to get them all at the same time and move them up all at the same time. But I've not got a clean selection there, so I'm just going to hit Z just to be able to select through everything like this. And then I can go G and then Z and then raise that up a little bit, tab back out, and then our job is done. Another great addition is that we have our quick menu, which we can get to with our Q key. At the moment, there's nothing in this list, but let's say we wanted to quickly be able to clean up the view by switching off all our overlays. We can just right click that and then add to the quick favorites. And now when we press Q, we'll have that show overlays in our little quick favorites menu. And let's go to the add menu, curve, and then right click on Bezier. We can go add to quick favorites there. And then again, Q menu, and then we can see we also have that option now. These are dependent on what mode you're in as well. So we're in object mode right now. So if I select this cube, tab into edit mode, and then press Q, you can see this is empty again. And maybe if we come over to long press the knife here and switch to the bisect tool and right click this, we can add that to quick favorites, press Q, and then we can just launch the tool straight away. And by the way, these gizmos are pretty cool too. Something else that's quite cool that we can do is combine the two rendering engines. So over here we've got Eevee and we've also got cycles that we can combine together in the compositor. So right here I have a scene called scene.eevee where I'm taking advantage of a lot of the quick volumetrics that we can get. And here in this scene we've basically got the same geometry with the same camera and same animation going on, but this time we're set to cycles. And if we go over to the compositor, you can see we've got the cycle scene here and our volumetrics Eevee scene here being combined together. And I've just put a little color correction on here to make it obvious how these two scenes are being treated differently. We can also do some pretty cool texture painting already. Let's jump over to the texture paint workspace. We've got some missing data here, so I'm going to add a paint slot. Let's make it some roughness and then click OK. And then in our overlays here, we can see the paint that we're actually painting, but I'm going to set that all the way down. Go over to the Eevee rendering engine. split this down a little bit, and then we'll see what happened in the shader there by jumping into the shader editor. We now have this texture, which goes into the roughness of a principled shader. If I just tab into edit mode and tab back out again, we'll just sort of refresh things in this view, and then we can start to paint in here. Just to make this more obvious though, I'm going to jump over to one of our look dev options, which means basically we can quickly see our scene using a HDRI. And so I'm going to set the metallic value of our shader up really high so that things are acting more as a mirror here, and you can see what we've painted on that side of the face. And we can just paint in the view to lay down some more roughness in this area, and then hold Control to start painting black in that area, since that's the other color in our palette. So these three icons here are the various shading modes that we have, though I believe there will be another one just for wireframe dedicated viewing mode, which is coming at some point. But in the meantime, to get our wireframe, here's what we might do. So tabbing into edit mode gives us this little icon, which we might remember from 2.79. This allows us to limit our selection to just what's visible. So in other words, if I press B and left click and drag across the view, it's only going to select the vertices that it can see in the viewport. So all these at the back here get missed. Let's undo that with Control Z and turn that option off. And now we can actually even see the wireframe at the back there. And now if we go B and left click and drag across the whole thing, we should get everything within our border that we selected there. Now what we can do with this, we can toggle that on and off with the Z key. Let's deselect with the Alt A shortcut now and press Z again to not limit our selection. So while that is giving us those wireframes in the back of the object, we might only want to see the wires and not any shading at all. So to do that, we're going to turn on our X-ray mode in the shading pull down, and then we can set that all the way down to 0. Now for some reason, that little icon that was over here has disappeared now, and let's go B and left click and drag across the whole thing just to see what we get, and we're getting everything. But if I press Z and then let's double tap A this time to deselect everything, and then B and left click and drag across again, now you can see that it isn't actually going to select everything. So even though we can't see that icon, Z is actually still toggling that on and off. So that at this point is probably worth bearing in mind. So we're in solid shading view right now, but we've got loads of viewing options even just in that. So for example, if we come to our overlays, we can switch on our face orientation, and if there's any back faces, then they'll show up as red. Or of course, we could just come over to here and switch on back face culling, and I'll switch face orientation back off again. I'm going to scale that plane right up with the S key, and then we can come over to shading and switch the shadow on, and we can set the intensity of that here. And also with this little cog icon, we can change the direction of it. If I select this cube and tab into edit mode and go back to overlays, you can see we get some more options over here as well, but many of these are quite standard from what we had before in 2.79 anyway. If I press 3 to switch to face select mode, I to inset, and then E to extrude down, we'll see another little option that we've got in here. I'm going to go back to shading and switch on cavity. And over here again, we have the little cog icon, and I'm going to hold shift and just set the distance really low on this. And then I'm going to turn the ridges up, which is giving us the bright edges there. And also we have our valleys, and I turn those up and we get those little kind of occluded areas inside. And this is a really good viewing mode, especially for sculpting and so on. And very quickly, what is look dev, this middle option? Well, that's just going to be an option where we can very, very quickly see the objects in our scene with these various different HDRIs, or we can combine that with our scene's lights. Very quickly able to test objects in your scene in different lighting conditions, basically. All right, so with those few things looked at, let's take a deeper dive. First things first, where do we get it? We get it from blender.org. From here we can click on the download blender, but that's going to be 2.79, B to be exact. So if we scroll down and go experimental, let's click on the latest experimental builds and scroll down again. You can see the red tag here is going to be Blender 2.8, and we navigate to our operating system and click on the version we need. For me, it's going to be Windows 64-bit. I'm going to click on that and save it. And this is developed rapidly and pretty much every day, so this is the version I'm getting for now, built on September the 15th. This is the name of the zip file I've just downloaded. I've extracted it here, and if I just kind of scroll down a little bit, I'll find the blender.executable file, and all we need to do is double click on it. And then after a few seconds, Blender 2.8 is bestowed upon us visually. We get this nice new splash screen with the specific information of the particular build that we've got here, but we can just click anywhere and we can start really getting our teeth into this. Just for completeness, if you've tried any previous 2.8 builds, we may need to wipe the previous user preferences to get some of the interface layout updates. And we can do that by simply loading the factory settings. So if we go up to File and Load Factory Settings, Little pop-up box shows up, load factory settings, okay, yes. And then we just need to save all of this as our new user preferences to overwrite any old preferences. Now into the rabbit hole we go, since back in 2.79 we'll find our user preferences in the file menu, but in 2.8 it's nowhere to be seen there. Also in 2.79 we could actually just switch a window to the user preferences and then we could get to our save user settings that way. Again, if we find our little window icon, which is at the top this time, we'll see that the user preferences aren't among all these options. And the shortcut was Control Alt and U, and if we try that, we're not going to get anywhere with that either in 2.8. So how do we get our user preferences in 2.8? Well, we'll find them in our new edit menu. So if we just come down here, we'll see user preferences at the bottom. So we'll launch that and click on save user settings there. If I close down the user preferences, we can also press F4 to bring our window context menu up and we'll find user preferences there. And if we close that down, we can also press the space bar and you'll see the search commands up here, and we could just type in user preferences and you can see show user preferences is also available from there. But for now, let's take a look at a couple of immediately obvious changes in the interface. First of all, looking at the layout side by side, so 2.79 on the left and 2.8 on the right, of course, and apologies for them being squished horizontally like this for a moment. But what might strike us first is the overall dark theme that we have here. Again, pressing F4 to launch our user preferences, we can see we have our themes tab. We can try any of these, for example, Flatty Light to give us more of a lighter theme, of course, or that we can reset to the default theme, which is this new dark theme we have now. Something else that might be quite striking is we have all this stuff in the viewport, which we don't have at all on this one. These are our interactive navigation tools. We can switch between perspective and orthographic using this first one. We can jump into the camera view using this one, or jump out again. We can pan around with this one, or we can move inwards and outwards with this one, and using this circle of gizmos over here, we can left click and drag inside and we can rotate around the view. If we don't like having all that stuff there, again, we can come over to our user preferences, and under the interface, we have our 3D viewport axis interactive navigation here. Let's just drag this down a little bit. And then we can set that to just the simple axis that we can replace it with, similar to as we have in 2.79 in the bottom left. Just to keep things all 2.8, I'm just going to leave that as it is. Possibly the next most noticeable thing is the fact that we have this tool shelf here, which is kind of floating, whereas before we had a complete vertical slice of tools that we have here. Now what 2.8 is taking advantage of here is the region overlap, which we did actually have in 2.79. If we just go to File, User Preferences here, go to System, and then find our region overlap settings there. You can see now we have a kind of faded view behind the viewport there. But in 2.8, we have this by default. So we can click Preferences, come over to System, and you can see there's region overlap on already. And if we turn that off, you can see we're getting a dark line which goes all the way vertically now. And again, we have this menu bar that was at the bottom in 2.79. We now have it by default at the top, which maybe makes a little bit more sense, but you can see this is also being affected by that region overlap setting in this case. So opening that back up, I'm going to switch that back on and then we can close that. Taking a look at the top, there's a pretty big change, but one that could be at first taken as quite subtle. In fact, there's actually several pretty big changes that we'll be looking at. But first though, there is now a dedicated menu bar. That's these things right here. In 2.79, as you can see, this is actually just the header of the info window. You can see on the far left, there's our option to be able to change the contents of that window. The window's actually just squashed up onto the top there, which we can actually pull down a little bit. Up here, we can't actually do that since, as I say, this is its own menu now. There is none of these little icons here for us to be able to change the contents of this. If we take a look in here, you can see we actually do still have the info window. If we click on that, you can see next to there now, we actually don't have any menu options. So let's just switch that back to a 3D view. If we right click at the top, we can actually go to header and then collapse those menus. And you can just click on these three horizontal lines now to get those options if you want. And otherwise we can middle click and drag across the top here to reveal the rest of the options that we have up there. I'm just going to right click and uncollapse that though. Next, along in 2.79, we have our Windows layouts. This is where we can change the amount of windows we have and what happens to be in each of those windows to suit various different tasks that are labeled as such here. And that's going to bring us to the next thing we have on the top of our menu bar here, and that's these tabs that are called modeling, sculpting, UV editing, and so on, which essentially do the same thing as the window layouts, but you're better thinking of as being ultra window layouts. Let's switch over to a full screen version of 2.8 just to reveal all of these a little bit better. For example, not just the Windows layout is remembered throughout the workspace. Things like viewport background settings, matcaps, current mode, and even what add-ons may happen to be enabled. Particularly useful if there happens to be hotkeys that conflict between different add-ons that you might have. So this all plays to the real purpose of these workspaces, which is to really allow a great deal of customization for each task that you find yourself doing within Blender. So if we were to jump to sculpting, for example, we're currently in modeling and in object mode. When we click on sculpting, which is the next one along, you'll see we're now in sculpt mode. Our matte cap has changed, and we can see we're in solid shading mode over here. If we switch over to shading, you'll see we've switched over to this middle icon here, the look dev mode. And if we jump over to 2D animation, we can see the color of our viewport has changed in the background there, and the angle of our view. Jumping back to the modeling workspace, I think we can understand these a little bit more if we bring in our properties window into this. So I'm just going to left click and drag this out a little bit. And we can see we have a new tab in here, which is our tools tab, and we've got a workspace area. So if we click on this, here you'll find how to set which mode that you end up being in when you switch to that workspace. Let's press F4 and open up our user preferences, and I'm going to go to add-ons. Now a lot of these add-ons are not yet upgraded, but this copy attributes menu is, so I'm going to enable that one and then close it. And you can see it's now shown up here in the filter add-ons section. And let's say we had it enabled for sculpting, for example. Let's come back over to this area. We're just going to close all this stuff down, come back over to the workspace area. You can see we're in the sculpt mode. And if we wanted to filter some add-ons, we can enable that, and we can say maybe we actually don't want the copy attributes menu to be enabled. So I'm just going to leave that one checked there. In fact, let's switch this to object mode. So we're currently in sculpt mode. So I'm going to switch back over to the modeling workspace, and you can see we're in sculpt mode again there. So I'm going to switch that to object mode. And if I press Control C, you can see we get our copy attributes menu. So that's working here. If we go to sculpting, where we've gone to filter the add-ons, you can see we're now in object mode. If I go Control C now, nothing happens. Or at least we copied the selected object to the buffer, but we don't get our copy attributes menu. And of course, rather than manipulating these default ones up here, we could just click on the plus icon, duplicate our current one, for example, double click on it here. We can call it, say, my workspace. And then to remove it again, we can right click and delete. In 2.79, next along has the current scene we happen to be in. This has now moved further to the right in 2.8. In fact, it's not immediately clear there. So let's jump into full screen 2.8. You can see after all our workspaces, we have our scene there. We've just got the one scene for the moment. And now it's also paired with this section over here, the render layer, which jumping into 2.79, we would have normally seen this sort of stuff in the layers tab of the properties window. And so this is where we need to talk about collections. So collections are like the new layers, but again, more like ultra layers, since we can do some things that the old layers couldn't. So to help illustrate this, rather than going to the bottom of the 3D view, as in 2.79, here's where we can control our layers. We instead need to jump into our outliner in 2.8, where we're going to be dealing with our collections. So over in 2.8, you can see here we've got collection number 1, which we can just double click on and call this anything we want, which is going to help keep track of everything in our scene. In 2.79, we would have needed to rely on the layer management add-on, and then once we've switched to the tab in the tool shelf, this is the only place that we can start trying to label what's going on and everything. So let's jump back into 2.8 and we'll take a look at our collections in a little bit more detail and how this affects what we're seeing up here. And let's also jump over to our layers tab in the properties window as well and open up our passes. All right, so let's get another object into the scene. Shift A, add a mesh UV sphere, for example. Press G to move that out of the way, and now let's put that in its own collection. To do that, I'm going to press the M key, M for move, to collection, and I'm going to click on the new collection option there, and let's call this spherical objects, and then click OK. And now we can see spherical objects has popped up there. Let's click on the little plus icons there and take a look to see exactly what's inside each collection. What we can do with our mouse cursor hovering in the outliner is we can press the C key, and that will create another collection for us. For example, this one, I'll just name extra collection. extra collection would work as well. If I just highlight this scene collection here and then press C, it's going to add it beneath whatever we had selected. So kind of like a child, if you like, another main one. We can move these around, so I can take this extra collection and left click and drag that onto this another main one and then open up that. You can see there's another extra collection. Now at the moment the sphere is just in that spherical objects, but there's no reason why it can't be in two collections at once. So what we can do is press Shift and M. And now we're going to link it to the another main one. Let's try the extra collection there. And then we'll click on the little plus icon there. And you can see not only is it in spherical objects, it's also in the extra collection as part of the another main one collection. So that was Shift M to be able to do that, rather than just pressing M on its own, which would just move it to a collection and take it out of whatever it was already in. So let's just pop that into another main one instead. And I'll choose another main one, so the root one there. And we can see the sphere is moved from everything else, and now it's just in that another main one. So how does that affect what we're seeing up here, this render layer? Well, the kind of information that this is going to record is what we have visible or not. So for example, let's say I go and add in with Shift A another plane, press G to move that out of the way. In fact, let's grab this extra collection and just delete it. I'll right click and delete. And what we can do here is shut off the visibility of that plane. Now, if we click on the plus icon there, I've added a new view layer in, and you can see we have the visibility of everything back again, but let's this time shut off the cube. So now what we've done is essentially recorded what we have visible and what we don't. So if we wanted to switch back to our other option where the cube was showing again and the plane wasn't, we just switch back to that one. Now it's worth emphasizing that this is just with the visibility, these eye icons here. So for example, if we set the rendering option to be not on for that plane, and then we switch back over to the view layer, you'll see that although the visibility comes back for it, you can see the rendering is still disabled. Now taking a look at this view layer that we have, you can see that we have various passes for it as well. So if we enable all of them there, now you might be thinking, where is this relevant? Well, if we come over to our compositing workspace, we can select to use nodes. There's our render layer going into our composite node. We want to select our scene. And then here at the bottom, we have our render layer or the view layer. At the moment, you can see the outputs of this render layer is just those three. And if we switch to the view layer, you can see we're going to get a whole load more outputs. So let's switch back to the modeling workspace. And I think the next thing we need to talk about is this hash symbol that we have, this kind of little gate sign. Now what's happening here is if we disable the visibility of a whole load of objects there, apart from maybe leave the camera still visible in the viewport there, if we press Alt H to unhide everything, it's basically going to do exactly what you might suspect. It's going to unhide everything. If we switch over to our render layer, you can see it's still remembered to make the plane invisible there. But again, if we go Alt H, it's just going to unhide everything. Now this little gate sign to indicate the viewport here, to restrict the viewport visibility, as you can see there, that's going to help us to keep track of objects that we want in our scene. But even when we hit that Alt H, we don't want them to be visible in our scene, or at least that's kind of the way I try and visualize it in my head anyway. So for example, if we set this one to be not visible in the viewport, then even when we press Alt H, it's not going to come back. So for example, we can hide the sphere, and then when we go Alt H, it'll bring back the sphere, but since this is restricted from the viewport, it's not going to bring back that plane. All right, so this little icon over here, we can click on that to create a new collection. I'm just going to call that another extra. And then when things start getting a bit crazy in here, we may want to use our text filter. So anything with the letter C in it will show up now. If we want to change what we're actually looking at, we can, instead of seeing the layers, we can just see the scenes. So if we add an extra scene, for example, so if we copy this one, and this is going to be our scene extra, you can see we have our scene and our scene extra now with no objects in there. If we select our scene and open that up, you can see that this one's got 3 objects in, and we can view them like this. This is a little bit reminiscent of the original way that Blender is working. We also have a filter up here, which is going to allow us to do some more filtering of what we actually see in here. So if we just turn off collections, that might clean up what you want to look at in your outliner. All right, so let's switch collections back on, and we'll try and tie this together with a little bit more of a sophisticated setup. So let's try this with a bit more of a sophisticated setup, or at least with more bells and whistles going on anyway. So in this scene, I've done a bit of a test to combine 2 different engines. I'm taking the surface shading of the Cycles rendering engine and the volumetrics of the Eevee engine To do that, I'm going to need two different scenes. So right now I'm in the modeling workspace and it's just got a bunch of pretty simple objects. This object is probably the more unusual of the two. And if I tab into it, you can see it's just this very simple geometry, solidified, beveled, and then an array spreads duplicates of it along this little corridor that we've got. And that's just a very simple sphere that we've got there. For the shading of these, if I jump into the shading workspace, this corridor has a very simple bit of noise just going into a color ramp, into the roughness. There's a couple of lamps that go along the corridor. I'm just going to jump back into the modeling workspace to show that. There's one of them and there's the other. And there's actually this volume object. And in this particular render layer, it's not set as visible. It's also not going to render either. So if we just turn that on and jump back to the shading, we can see here's our volume shader. So I'm basically just using some noise again, just to go into the density. First of all, I'm just clamping that together with this color ramp. And the reason I've got two of these spread out is because this is what's going to happen when we're set to cycles for rendering. And this is what's going to happen for Eevee. Now at the moment, it's basically just the same, but I split that out just in case I wanted to play with some differences there. Otherwise, I have this noise texture, which has just got some animation going on in the distortion. Now this layer, this render layer, is being used for rendering, as you can see here. And again, just to emphasize this, we're set to cycles. And jumping back to the layer, we can see we have this other one, volumetrics, which basically means everything gets shut off apart from this volume object, which allows us to be able to do a few tests in here if we wanted to. Now at this point, you may need to actually just make sure you've highlighted the correct material output. But as you can see for volumetrics in cycles, with the current settings that we've got anyway, the default settings, this is going to take quite a long time. So hence why I thought I'd try out the much faster Eevee volumetrics and see if we can combine the two. But this volumetrics only layer gives us a chance to see what it would basically be like in cycles. But as you can see here, we're not going to use this for rendering. So let's come over to our compositing tab. So this cycle scene I'm representing as the master scene, and the render layer here, here's our scene, and there's the render layer. And then here we've got another render layer, which is our Eevee scene, which just has the one view layer in it. And we're just doing a little bit of color correction and just adding them together. Now, technically, you should, I think, be able to just simply hit render, hit F12, and it should render everything out okay, but doesn't seem to be rendering the second scene that we've got here. So to manually do this, we're just going to click on this little render icon there. And now you'll see our volumetrics from that layer shoot up. And as you can tell, that was pretty fast. Control Shift clicking on these is going to hook us up to our viewer node here and just show us in the backdrop that we've got enabled, what's going on there. And similarly here. And this is basically the result of what we're getting in that other scene. So let's take a look in that other scene. Let's go jump into scene.eevee, and then let's take a look at the modeling workspace. So the scene looks extremely similar, but of course, if we go over to here, we're using the Eevee engine, and coming over to the layer, we're going to use it for rendering. Now you'll notice it also has a slightly different set of collections and so on, so you can organize these completely differently. And we have this volume.eevee object. This is a unique object just to this scene, but it's basically using exactly the same shader as we just saw a moment ago in cycles. All of this stuff that we have in this collection here, all of this is linked from the original scene. So if we go to the scene again and come to the correct layer, this render layer, we can take these objects and we can have them showing up in other scenes. So let's just take a look at this object, for example, these ridges, and let's come over to the shading, and you'll see on this one, we have just a simple principled BSDF for cycles happening here, but in Eevee, it's going to give us this flat black material, which is why it allows us to add in the compositing just the volumetrics, basically. So just to illustrate, it's really easy to add a new scene. You can just click on the plus, we can copy, we can link objects and so on. I'm just going to do a new one for now, just to start it fresh. Let's come over to the modeling workspace and show that this is a scene which is absolutely blank. There's no objects in here, and we don't even have a world set or anything. And we can just start adding objects in here, and that'll be unique to this scene. But if, say, we wanted to preserve or use, say, the camera that we have in this scene, since it does have animation data on it, we can just select it, go Control L, and then make a link to this new scene, scene.001. Once you do that, we can jump into our scene.001 and we should have it there. And we do. There's a little bit of a weird bug, I think, though, which is just, it doesn't seem to be quite right. So I'm just going to add in a quick object and then just delete it again, and you can see it's kind of refreshed the scene and we can see it now, and you can see there's our animation data with it and everything. So with this scene now, we have the liberty to be able to set what engine we want to render with, what layers we want to render, what passes we want to use in that layer, and then we can combine that in our master scene, so by jumping into our compositing workspace. So hopefully that makes sense as a quick breakdown and overview of bringing together your scenes and layers. And don't worry, we'll of course be returning to the subject in future videos to explore it all in further step-by-step detail. But next, let's take a look at some more 2.8 changes, and we'll try to get through these a little bit quicker. So immediately below the menu bar, we have another new UI component. This is our horizontal toolbar, basically reflecting the new tool tab of the properties window, which is actually quite good for when you're just working in one large window. So if we go Control Space to maximize this view, and let's say maybe switch to sculpt mode and select the sculpt draw brush, you can see along our toolbar here, you get all the various options. And if I go Control Space to minimize that view, you can see them in this Tools tab of the Properties window. Something that's worth remembering is that you may be drawn up to the left-hand side, but remember there will be a few options lingering on the right side too. This can be collapsed, by the way. We can just hover where we get our double arrows and left-click and drag up. And so we can completely collapse that down if we want to. And now we can move on to our tool shelf, which we can toggle on and off with the T key. Again, this can be shrunk or expanded by hovering our cursor where we get our double arrows, and we can pull that right out, or we can shrink it to this kind of collapsed view, or even further like this. So there's a little bit more going on here this time than the previous tool shelf. And also if you just inspect the bottom right of some of these options, you can see a little triangle. So if we left click and hold down the mouse on there, you can see sometimes we get some alternative options showing up. Well, let's switch back over to object mode, and I think this allows us to spend a little bit of time just highlighting another very key difference in the new 2.8 user interface. And one of the things which might be immediately noticeable when you load it up is the fact that we have this option highlighted. In 2.79, pressing tools on the tool shelf immediately engaged the tool, which sort of made using some of them a little bit awkward. So if I click on this translate here, it immediately starts trying to move the object while the cursor is still up here where the button is. In 2.8, instead the interface waits for what we now want to do with that selected tool, and you can see which is our selected tool because of this blue highlighting. The fairly large implication of this is that we're no longer necessarily just constrained to having the left mouse be for setting the position of the 3D cursor. For example, here we have the move tool. If we left click into the 3D view there, you can see the 3D cursor isn't changing its position. And also if we left click onto our select border here, you can see we have some helpful hints at the bottom. We can set our 3D cursor with the left click, but if we left click and hold, we can border select. So as you can see, that's going to change the 3D cursor position. But if we left click and drag, you can see we're going to get a border select. We've also got at the top in our toolbar, we have some of the options with that tool. So for example, if we wanted to essentially invert what we had now, we can set it to difference and left click and drag across everything there. And it's going to deselect what we had selected and select what we didn't within that border. You'll also notice these little triangles in the bottom right. That means we've got a couple of extra options to do with this. So we can use our select circle, which we can left click and drag around the scene, and use our middle mouse wheel to change the size off. So with that distinction out of the way, the fact that we're just readying the tool, let's check out this cursor option. So the 3D cursor is actually now in 3D. It's not just kind of a 2D representation. You kind of see that it's got these black lines emitting from it, which are definitely representing the orientation of the view there. Just as a quick reminder, you can see the 2D cursor there. It just has those 4 little black lines that surround it. So what's the big deal with this? Well, we could double tap R and just enter into a trackball rotation with this cube, tab into edit mode, be somewhat puzzled as to why this is slightly triangulated already. Let's just go Alt J to go tris to quads, and then go Control B to bevel all the edges there. And then what we'd like to do is orient our movement of everything. So let's tab back into object mode and go to the move tool. So we would like these axes to be aligned to, let's say, this face here. So let's come over here and set it from global to the 3D cursor, and then switch to our 3D cursor. And instead of the orientation being aligned to the view, we're going to align it to the geometry. Left click and drag somewhere onto this face there. Now, it does seem to be a little bit embedded past the actual face that we're clicking on there, despite having surface project on, but I think that might just be a bit of a bug. But if we switch back to the move tool now, you should be able to see this blue axis should be aligned with that face. And we can left click and drag on that blue axis to move it in that position if we want. So annotate basically replaces the old grease pencil, as what was the old grease pencil has now actually got super sophisticated and kind of overly complicated for what started out as just being a simple annotation tool. So we can just left click and drag in the view to just sketch something in here. Or we can left click and drag on here for some of the other options. So like this line, left click and drag to just draw something a little bit straighter there. If we press N to open up our properties sidebar, you can see we've got our notes down here that we can turn the visibility on and off for. To delete some of these, we can just hold down the D key, D for draw, and then right mouse button instead of the left mouse button, just to remove some of our strokes here. And again, middle mouse wheel to increase the size of the brush. The grease pencil hasn't been deleted, of course. In fact, we can go Shift A and add in now grease pencil objects. So for example, like a grease pencil monkey, let's press G and just move that out of the way. This could be a whole video in of itself. Pull out the size of our properties window here on the side. We can see we even have an extra tab in our properties just for grease pencil. So we can just start to blur this, for example. I'm going to left click and drag across those and increase the factor. And there's plenty of very cool stuff that we could do with this, but we'll save that for another time. Alright, now let's step it up a bit by loading up a pretty complicated file created in 2.79. For example, the robo_03_final.blend. That's available in the project files folder under Blender files and robo stages in the hard surface modeling course. Now this is a pretty complicated blend file with lots of modifiers on the objects and so on, so maybe it's not going to work first time. But it's also worth mentioning that we have this load UI option, and I'm going to make sure that we have that checked off because I don't want to override all the workspaces with the old Windows layouts. So with that, we can see here's our robo. I'm just going to pull out the window slightly, and you can see we're set to cycles, and here's all our collections, which are basically our layers that we were using. And if we select an object and come over to the modifiers tab, you can see it's preserved all the many different modifiers that we have on this thing to just expect to be able to work in 2.8, and yet we seem to be doing pretty well with this. All right, let's switch over to the render tab, and we're set to cycles. Let's go Shift Z to switch into our rendered view and take a look, and let's hit the pause button up here to stop calculating the rendering. I think that's good enough for the moment. So there's a few missing things on here. What I'll do is come down and switch these guys on to collection 16 and 17, turn the rendering options on as well, and then unpause that, and we can see how that's supposed to look in cycles. All right, let's press Z to jump out of our rendered view into solid shading, and let's switch over to Eevee. And then again, Shift Z, and that's looking pretty good as well. And it's working pretty smoothly as well. So the next thing we want to do is just adjust this shader. It's a very simple shader, but I'm just going to demonstrate a quick issue with it. So if I left click and drag from the top right corner there, just to split the view. And then instead of going for a node editor, as we would in 2.79, what we want to do instead is to find our shader editor. So I'm going to click on that, press N to close out that side, zoom in a little bit. And to demonstrate a slight problem that we have with this, I'm actually going to set on the ambient occlusion. Let's open up the options that we've got here and turn up the factor to say something like 5, just to really darken it up. And with this shader, this principled shader and material output that we had on the object, what we're going to need to do is basically just create some new ones instead. So Shift A, let's add a shader principled BSDF, and let's connect that to an output, material output. So I'm just going to hook these up, and then when we click on this material output, currently this is the one which is highlighted. So as you can see, we've got that red bar. But when I click on this one, it'll update all the objects that are using this, which is pretty much everything, to suddenly use this one. Now, the problem with this is if we play with our distance, you can see it's not really having much of an effect. Apparently the ambient occlusion isn't really working there. The sort of result we should expect hopefully will become clear once I click on this material output. But in fact, I don't think it is actually doing that. So I'm going to press A to select them all and press X to delete everything in there, and then go Shift A and add in a shader principled BSDF again, and then also the output and material output, and then hook those up. And then now it's actually working a lot better. because if we play with this distance, now you should be able to see that it is actually having an effect. Whereas before, it was almost acting as if the whole side was being shaded, and ambient occlusion isn't quite supposed to work like that. So even with all this, the viewport is pretty responsive. And if we jump into the renderable camera with 0 on the numpad and make it look like it should do when it's rendered, we can actually just click this button here where it says next to the overlays, and that should shut everything off that isn't related to the render. And to compare that to how it would look in cycles, I've got a little bit of a quick render. And you can see it's basically Eevee is a pretty decent representation of the general lighting. Alright, so to try and get our Eevee render looking a little closer to our cycles rough representation that we have here, the ambient occlusion is coming in pretty handy. I've got that set to a distance of 0.1 and a factor of 2 at the moment. And if we turn that off, you can see that's helping to really bring out these areas under the hood of the front camera area. But now let's take a look at some more shadow aspects of this. And we've got the shadows area here set to ESM. This is an exponential method. Let's switch off 3 of these lamps that we've got in here and just have light 01 ready. So we've just got shadows coming from one direction basically. And you can see towards here, the shadow is not really very strong. And if we try switching over to VSM, the variance method instead, you can see we're getting like a slightly better result. But in other areas, it may not be quite to your liking. I think this method is perfectly fine, but I'm just going to switch it back to ESM for the moment, as we do actually have another feature we can try, which is coming over to the lamps tab. We can switch on our contact shadows, and that's going to fill in a lot of those areas for us. In fact, in general, in the small nooks and crannies of the mesh, it's really coming in really nicely. So if we click on that, you can see it fills in a lot of these details really well, as we have on our cycles version. And without them, you can see we're getting a lot of bright reflection happening there, which we don't really have on that version. So I'm going to switch that on. And now down at the bottom, it's a little bit large and clumpy, and I don't really want that. So I'm going to set the distance to just fill that in a little bit, something like 0.4. And also I'm going to soften it right up to something around 1.5. Now with that, we've got our other lights that we can enable, and that's going to soften a lot of those shadows back again. But if we just shift select them all, and then I'm going to make the light 01 to be the active object there, what we can do is we can alt click on these things, and it's going to change the value on everything that we've got selected. So if I alt click that again, it's going to turn on contact shadows for all of them. If I alt click into here and set that at 0.4 again, it's going to set that for all the objects. And if I do that again with this, alt click into that field, I can go 1.5. You can see it's going to soften everything out all at the same time. And while it isn't perfect, I think we've actually got a pretty decent representation that we could continue to refine further, but hopefully that's enough information to go on to just keep on tweaking with these settings. All right, so I've jumped into another little test scene to help illustrate a few things about the shaders in 2.8, in Eevee in particular, and that should transition us nicely into some of the rendering viewport effects. So this sphere has a very simple principled BSDF on it, and this one has a very similar one, but I've colored it red. This one's more on the green side. But if we take a look at this, you can see that we're not really getting any of those colors bouncing onto our middle sphere there. And that's where one of our probes is going to come in handy. So if we select the probes collection, that means that when I go Shift A to add in a light probe, it's going to add it to that collection. So I'm going to choose an irradiance volume, press Alt G to reset the position there, and then go S and scale that up. And you can see that this has lots of little dots in there. Those are the sample points it's going to use to detect what kind of light bounces we should put on objects in our world. We can set that over here in the light probes tab, set the resolution of the data points, if you like, and then we can come over to the render tab, and then we can bake our indirect lighting right there. So it says no light cache in this scene, so I'm just going to try that again, bake indirect light, and now it seems like it's worked this time. 8.9 megabytes in memory, and we can see if we look at this sphere now, we definitely get a little bit of red showing up on this side, and we get a little bit of green bouncing on that side. And you can see in the viewport, instead of just being dots now, you can see these tiny little spheres which show a diffused capture of the kind of lighting information it's found in those areas. We can actually turn up the size of these guys by playing with this irradiance display, or switch them off altogether by hitting the icon there. So I'm just going to keep these pretty low, just hold Shift and get a finer control and set it to about there. And I'm pretty happy with that. And I think we need one of these irradiance volumes in there before we can get our reflection cube maps to work, which you can see underneath the indirect button. So we have this cylinder in the scene, which is just, again, a principled BSDF shader, and it's metallic, but it's got a tiny little bit of roughness on there, so it's almost a mirror-like shine. In fact, it doesn't look very mirror-like because we've just got a flat dark grey colour to our world. But if we come over to our look dev, you can see when we end up using one of these other HDRIs just to test the lighting for a second, you can see that it's definitely pretty shiny. So let's just come back over to Eevee, and you can see also the lamps are being reflected. If I just grab this with G and move it around, you can see we obviously get the reflections there, but we're not really getting any of the objects in the scene show up, and that's where our reflection cube map is going to come in. So let's go Shift A and add in a light probe reflection cube map. Alt G to just move that to the center of the world again, scale that up so it encompasses the objects in our scene. G and then Shift Z to not move it up and down on the Z axis, and then I'm going to go G and then Z just to move that up a little bit there, and that's in a position where I want to bake now. So let's click on the bake cube map, and we can see now in our more metallic object we're definitely getting some reflections which can trick the eye into thinking they're pretty decent reflections. This is a kind of less intensive way of getting the reflections in our more shiny objects, but if we want to go full on, we can actually come over to the screen space reflections area and just enable that. And you can see now we also get things like the reflections happening right here. Without that, if we turn that off, you can see we don't have anything like that. Now it's worth bearing in mind, if we turn this on, and we've been using a light probe already from the looks of it, you can see our light probe is actually showing up in the reflections. I think maybe even some reflections from the light probe are kind of overriding what the screen space stuff is doing. So I'm actually just going to grab this light probe here and just delete it, and then just bake the cube map only again. And now we get a little bit more of a clean result from our screen space stuff. And you'll notice some of this is a little bit noisy, and that's due to our sampling. We can come to this and set that way higher. So let's set that the same as the renders, just set that up to 64. And you can see now it's starting to look a little bit cleaner there. But if we want to keep things nice and fast in the viewport, we can just lock it down to something lower. We've also got refraction enabled here, and that allows us to come over to this sphere object that we've got. If we come over to the material tab, we can set in the options whether we want to use that screen space refraction or not. If we turn that on, you can start to see we get some interesting cool refraction effects, and we can set the IOR in here. All right, with that done, let's take a look at another shader. Here's our transparent shader. These two planes are basically using the same thing. We don't need to look at this probe stuff anymore, so I'm just going to shut the visibility of those off in the viewport. Now on this transparent shader here, all it is a noise texture which goes and gets its contrast increased with this color ramp by squeezing in either side of the black and white ends there, and that's going to inform the factor input of a mix shader, which is just mixing between a transparent shader and a principled BSDF. Now if you try this by default, you're not really going to see anything in the viewport. What you're going to need to do is come over to the options area and make sure our blend mode is set to alpha blend in this case. Usually that gives the best results, but it probably is the most performance intensive. So if you can get away with, say, alpha clip instead, then it's definitely worth replacing it with that. But in this case, I want all those nice gray soft transitions. Instead of that, it's either transparent or it's not type of look. Also, we've got some transparent shadows going on here. If we don't really need these, again, we can switch them off to save a little bit of screen rendering time. But otherwise, if you can get away with it, we can, again, we've got hashed and clip or just opaque. Opaque is the shape of the object itself, kind of ignoring the transparency. The clip, we can set our clip threshold here just to get what we need. But otherwise, if we can get away with it, maybe hashed might be pretty useful for us too. So while there is still plenty to be done in Blender 2.8, it's still pretty cool what you can get away with. In this scene, for example, I was just trying to test out a game development idea, and a lot of the things that I was trying to do with modifiers to kind of get these effects just weren't working, but there were other effects and things which kind of did the same effect that I was going for, and I really tried to push what I could do in the viewport here with all this sort of stuff, and it still ended up running pretty smooth while working. So I think we've got a lot to look forward to in Blender if already we can do so much with it. So not everything is working. For example, if we go F4 and then take a look at our user preferences, you can see in the add-ons list there's a whole load of updates still required, and you'll probably find that it is still crashing quite a lot. A lot of those crashes are ready to be logged at the moment, since as I'm recording this we're at the Alpha 2 stage. I believe the schedule is expected to go into beta around the end of October, and then maybe we'll get an official release sometime early 2019. Before that we'll get release candidates, of course, and we have our daily builds that we can get each day along the way. The 2.8 code quest allowed a lot of support to be injected into Blender's development, and while that is technically over, it is still possible to support Blender. We can donate to the development fund, which I've got on another tab here actually, or you could join the Blender Cloud and get a whole load of extra bits and pieces at the same time. About a year ago, I made a video going over where Eevee was at that time, and you'll be able to find that on YouTube, on the CG Masters YouTube channel. It's wild how far 2.8 has come in between now and then. And if you scan through that, you might well pick up a few extra tips that I actually didn't cover this time around. For owners of the hard surface modeling course, we'll include the robot final blend file in Eevee for you. And while we're uploading that to the course, we may as well add the sci-fi corridor and combined render engine test too, should you want to inspect those files in more detail. So in any case, many thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.